right, everybody, welcome to our third quarter virtual lecture for tonight of 2026. I'm Emily, and I'm basically overseeing the Zoom meetings right now, the virtual lectures. Um, we have with us a wonderful guest. We have a wonderful privilege of hearing Jonathan from Chosen People Ministries deliver a wonderful topic. We're diving into the apologetics of basically the Jewish view of Jesus's death and resurrection. So I'm not going to talk anymore. I am actually going to turn it completely over to Jonathan. And Jonathan, the floor is yours. Take it away. Jonathan, I think you're muted. All right. So let's see.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Can everyone else
Great.
hear Jonathan? Give a thumbs up if you can hear Jonathan. Perfect. All right.
Great.
And also, as usual, everyone, the chat is also open. So if there is a question that maybe your screen is off and muted and you're doing other things as well, make sure you type in the chat any kind of questions you may have, and I'll do my best to read through them. I'm going to mute my mic now, and Jonathan, go on ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Emily, for the invitation to speak. It's really an honor and a privilege to be with you all here on the Bible History Center. So, just to give a little bit of background on myself, was born and raised in the Messianic Jewish community. So, I'm a second generation Messianic Jew. My parents are the first ones in their families to follow Jesus as the Messiah. I did my bachelor's degree in history and did my MTS in New Testament and started with Chosen People Ministries working on staff in 2022. And really, my desire is to bring the good news of Jesus to Jewish people. I was just talking with Emily before we got on here about the passage from Romans 1:16, which says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first the Jew, then to the Gentile." And just a little bit about Chosen People Ministries. Chosen People Ministries, really, we started 132 years ago with a Hungarian Orthodox rabbi named Leopold Kohn in Brooklyn, New York. So 1894. And really, our ministry exists to pray for, evangelize, disciple, and serve Jewish people and help fellow believers do the same. So, really, today I really want to get into the topic of Jesus' resurrection. And so, just to begin, kind of a story here. Actually, I was just thinking about how long ago this was, and this was actually 10 years ago. So, 10 years ago, I was at Messiah Conference, and I have the picture there of Messiah College where this conference is held. It's a Messianic Jewish conference held in Pennsylvania. It's an annual conference, and really, this is a place for Messianic Jews and also Gentiles who come to really learn and grow as community, as the Messianic community. And at this conference, for many years, there's been some guys in tents who come at the entrance to the campus of the college where the conference is, and they're part of an organization called Jews for Judaism. Now, these are Orthodox rabbis mostly, and what they do is they sit out in these tents and they wave people in, hoping to have conversations with Jewish followers of Jesus in order to pretty much deconvert them from believing in Jesus, to bring them home to Judaism, because from the perspectives of these rabbis and other people who are volunteering for Jews for Judaism, they see Jewish followers of Jesus as going astray and even committing idolatry. So they want to bring us back. And so I was speaking at this conference to the 13 to 30-year-olds for the Young Messianic Jewish Alliance. I was speaking on how we can know Yeshua, Jesus, is the Messiah, and really showing how the resurrection is really the indication of how we really know that Jesus is the Messiah. So this rabbi there, as you see pictured, I didn't take this picture, but I found it on Facebook. But the rabbi who's waving there, I talked with him, Rabbi Yisrael Blumenthal, and he said, we can talk about any topic you want to talk about. And so I was excited. I said, okay, great. I like to talk about Jesus' resurrection. And he says, great. He said, but let me just tell you this. He says, even if you could show me historically, even if you could prove that Jesus rose from the dead, even if Jesus came right now and he was standing right in front of me, I still would not believe he's the Messiah. And that really struck me because the resurrection was really the evidence that Jesus is the Messiah for me. And he says, the reason why I say this is because in the Torah, specifically in the book of Deuteronomy, there's a passage there, chapter 13, that says that even if someone comes to you, that comes to the Jewish people, comes to Israel, and they give a sign or wonder, even if they give a miracle, that miracle will not indicate that they're truly from God. And actually, the text says that God is testing Israel. So the resurrection for this rabbi would just be a test from God to see whether he, as a Jew, would be faithful to God rather than following and worshiping a false Messiah. That's where he was going. And really, these guys, these Jews for Judaism, they've been coming to Messiah Conference at this time for 40 years. 40 years coming at this tent and having conversations with Messianic Jews like myself. And really, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond to that argument. It was actually the strongest objection to Jesus that I've heard up to that point, and really I didn't know what to say. So we talked for actually a couple hours about the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, but I didn't understand how I couldn't find a way around the theological implication of it from his Jewish perspective. Now, this is a Jewish perspective. This is a Jewish perspective that many in the more observant or Orthodox community would have, that even if they don't say he rose from the dead, but even if he did, that wouldn't mean anything, because when they think about it, when a Jewish person thinks about it, it would just be a test from God to see whether they'll follow him rather than worship and follow a false Messiah, who they view Jesus is. So really what I want to do is kind of take you in this presentation through the ways I've been able to carefully evaluate this rabbi's argument since that conversation. And really after studying the text and discussing this issue with a number of rabbis like him or counter missionaries and other people really, and through study, even going into this topic even more so for my master's thesis, really just to see how Deuteronomy 13 is actually an excellent text to show that the resurrection really is the indication that Jesus is the Messiah. So that's what I want to do this evening, and so let's kind of get started here by looking at the text from the Torah that this rabbi was describing. So let me read it first. The text says, "If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder that he tells you comes to pass, and if he says, 'Let us go after other gods which you have not known, and let us serve them,' you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God is testing you, to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall walk after the Lord your God, and fear him, and keep his commandments, and obey his voice, and you shall serve him, and hold fast to him." Now, this passage provides the criteria for Israel to distinguish between a true prophet and a false prophet. And right there we see that the reason the false prophet can perform signs and wonders or perform miracles is because God is testing Israel. And according to the Deuteronomy 13 verse 6, it says that the punishment for this false prophet leading Israel astray is death. So I want to ask questions to this text. I want to look at the Bible and ask certain questions of the text. And the first one I want to ask is, why would a false prophet use a miraculous sign to lead Israel astray? Like, why would the false prophet do that in the first place? And so I'm going to argue that it's because the Torah teaches that God validates his prophets, his true prophets, through miraculous signs. So let's look at one passage to start, at least one passage from the Torah that where we find this. So in Exodus chapter 4, verse 1 through 5, this is what we read. Happens, Exodus 4 is what happens right after God appears to Moses through the burning bush. And this is what we read in verses 1 through 5. Then Moses answered, "But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.' The Lord said to him, 'What is that in your hand?' He said, 'A staff.' And he said, 'Throw it on the ground.' So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, 'Put out your hand and catch it by the tail.' So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. And this is the key part, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." So the reason that the people, the leaders of Israel, are to believe that Moses is a true prophet is because of how God validates him through these miraculous signs that he provides them with. And what God does is he provides Moses with these miracles. And when we read on in Exodus 4, 28 through 31, we read, "And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord with which he had sent him to speak, and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the people of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people, and the people believed." So there we see the reason the elders of Israel are convinced that Moses was a true prophet is because they witness how God validated him through these miraculous signs. And it's actually the same Hebrew word there that we actually find in Deuteronomy 13, ha'otot. So we read on and we go through the story of Passover and see that when Moses goes to Egypt, he tells Pharaoh that God has sent him and that he should let the people go and serve him, to serve God. And so Pharaoh continuously refuses Moses's instruction and telling him, "We need to let the people go." And so God judges Egypt with 10 devastating plagues. We see the Nile River turning to blood. We see frogs being sent down. We see the land being covered in darkness. And finally, the 10th plague being the death of the firstborn. And so Moses eventually relents and he lets the people go. And so Moses goes and he takes the people. He follows God, who is in the form of a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. And they're approached, the people of Israel are approached with the Red Sea. And they see it in front of them. They see this huge obstacle. And how are they going to get through? Well, Moses raises his rod and the Red Sea splits. The people can go through it on dry ground. And then the Egyptian army is coming from behind. And so what God does is through Moses as a prophet, he raises his rod and the seas come crashing on the Egyptian army. And then as the people are looking back on what God has just done, we read from Exodus 14:31, Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So the reason the people of Israel have faith that Moses is a true prophet is because they witnessed how God validated him through these miraculous signs and ultimately the destruction of the Egyptian army. Another example of seeing the way in which God validates his prophets through miracles is found in 1 Kings 17, 21 through 24, when Elijah visits the widow of Zarephath because her son had just recently died. And so what Elijah does is he stretches himself over this child 3 times. He cries out to the Lord saying, "O Lord, my God, let this child's life return to his body." So he's calling out to God to resuscitate her son from the dead. And so we read, the Lord heard Elijah's plea. The child's life returned to his body and he revived. Elijah picked up the child and brought him down from the upper room into the main room, and he gave him to his mother. "See," said Elijah, "your son is alive." And so the woman answered Elijah, she says, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord is truly in your mouth." So what happened here is that God validated Elijah as a true prophet to this mother by empowering him here, by raising the son from the dead. And so we read on with Elijah. In 1 Kings 18, this is a great example of where Elijah has this showdown with the prophets of Baal, where there's all these 450 false prophets of Baal, and there's Elijah, and Elijah wants to call the people back to God. And so what Elijah does is he sets up a test where he says, okay, set up an offering, and whichever God answers by fire, that God is the true God. And so the prophets of Baal, these false prophets, they call out to their God, they start cutting themselves, and then Elijah starts mocking them because their God Baal is not sending fire down on their offering. But then when it's Elijah's turn, Elijah pleads to the Lord. He says, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known that day, this day, that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. And so what happens here is fire falls down from heaven, and the people fall on their faces declaring, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. And so here we see a great example of how God is validating the prophet Elijah as a true prophet by empowering this miracle, by answering his prayer of sending fire down from heaven. And there's many examples that we find throughout the Old Testament, or we call in the Jewish community, we call it Tanakh, revealing that God validates true prophets through signs and wonders. And this helps us understand why the false prophet described in Deuteronomy 13 would perform signs and wonders to lead Israel astray. What they're doing is they're mimicking the real thing. They know that God validates true prophets by providing miracles, these signs and wonders, and this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to mimic the real thing in an attempt to lead Israel, the people, astray. And so we read on, and I want to say that we can ask another question, which is, okay, so God validates true prophets through miracles. How then can Israel distinguish between a true prophet and a false prophet if they're both producing miracles? How do we know which miracle is actually validating? And I think we get a lot of clues and indications here from the text itself, from Deuteronomy 13. So I highlighted in yellow areas where I think are really helpful here, because what we learn is that the false prophet tells the people to go after other gods which they have not known, and to serve these other gods. We see that the reason God is testing Israel is that he wants Israel to see whether they love the Lord their God with all your heart, with all your soul. The command there is to walk after the Lord your God and fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice, and to serve God and hold fast to God. And the false prophet is trying to make the Jewish people, Israel, leave the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. So the key here to identifying whether the one who claims to be a prophet is truly a prophet sent by God is by evaluating whether they affirm the Torah or deny the Torah, whether they are telling the people to follow God or whether they are telling the people to walk away from God and serve other gods. And so we get this language of, you see there, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. This is language that we find in other places in Deuteronomy, where we see this in Deuteronomy 6, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Or Deuteronomy 10, and now Israel, what does the Lord require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep his commandments. Or Deuteronomy 11:13, and if you will indeed obey my commandments that I command you today, to love the Lord your God, to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. So the point here is that Israel expresses their love towards God by being obedient to the commands that he gave them in the covenant. So if someone comes to Israel and they claim to be a prophet and they lead the Jewish people, Israel, to forsake obedience to the commandments that God gave them, then that teaching indicates that that person is a false prophet. No matter what miracle they provide, whatever what sign or wonder they provide, that teaching indicates that they are a false prophet. So this raises another question. Okay, well then how do false prophets perform signs and wonders? Like where are they getting this power? How are they able to do this if they're not from God? And I think there's a very good Jewish text that helps us answer this question, and it's actually the first book in the New Testament. The New Testament is Jewish literature, Second Temple Jewish literature, and Matthew provides a great example of a Jewish perspective on miracles and this text in Deuteronomy 13. So Matthew 12, verse 22 through 24, we read this. Then a demonized man who was blind and mute was brought to Jesus, and Jesus healed him, so that the man spoke and saw. And all the people were amazed and said, "Can this be the son of David?" But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, "It is only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that this man casts out demons." So right here we see that Jesus heals a man who is inhabited by a demon, who's demonized. And then the result, after he heals him, after he casts out the demon, after he heals the man who's blind and mute, the crowds there, the Jewish crowds say, "Can this be the son of David?" And the Pharisees respond that it's actually, he's doing these miracles by something, or actually someone other than God, in this case, the prince of demons. So they're not denying that Jesus is doing a miracle, they're just denying that God is behind it. And I think there's another text that provides some help here. And this is from Maimonides in a letter he wrote to a Jewish community in Yemen. And Maimonides is a 12th century Jewish philosopher, probably one of the most influential Jewish philosophers recognized today. And Maimonides says this. He says, "We are enjoined to yield obedience to one who asserts that he is a prophet, provided he could substantiate his claims by miracle or proofs. Although there is a possibility that he is an impostor, however, if the would-be prophet teaches tenets that negate the doctrines of Moses, then we must repudiate him." So Maimonides here is actually, he's not a follower of Jesus. He was actually a critic of Yeshua, of Jesus, but he reads Deuteronomy 13 and understands that yes, Israel is supposed to obey a prophet who comes from God, who has a miracle that substantiates his claims, but there's a possibility that the one doing that miracle is an imposter, and the way you know if they're an imposter is if they contradict the Torah. We see further that Maimonides is understanding Deuteronomy 13 by reading what he says in Mishnah Torah. He says, describing this false prophet in Deuteronomy 13, is coming to deny the prophecy of Moses. Therefore, we may definitely conclude that he is a false prophet, and everything that he did was performed through sorcery and magic. So according to Maimonides, the key to knowing whether one is a true prophet or a false prophet is really twofold: their view of Torah and the power behind their sign. If one claims to be a prophet, they produce a sign, and they teach Torah, that teaching indicates that God empowered their sign. Thus, they're a true prophet. On the other hand, if one claims to be a prophet, they produce a sign, and they teach against Torah, their teaching indicates that their sign was empowered by something or someone other than God, and they're a false prophet. So if one claims to be a prophet, and we know that their miracle was provided, that they provide comes from God, then they're a true prophet, and the way we know that is based on their teaching. And I really think Maimonides is right here. We get an example of false prophets or people using power other than God to perform miracles in actually the Exodus narrative. So in Exodus chapter 7, we see that after Moses, through God's power, turns water into blood, the Nile River, it says in Exodus 7:22 that the magicians of Egypt did the same thing by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. So here we see that the magicians in Exodus 7 are mimicking Moses' miracle by turning water into blood. And the text specifically calls these people magicians, and it says that they use their secret arts. When the rabbis of the Talmud, so these are rabbinic sages, are describing what's going on here, they actually attribute the power of these magicians in Exodus 7 to demons. You can read about that in the Talmud in Sanhedrin 67b, which describes their acts as employing acts of demons there. So to kind of put this in a kind of a flow chart to help understand Deuteronomy 13. This is kind of the way I'm formulating it. So someone comes to Israel and they claim to be a prophet. They produce some miraculous sign, but then they deny the Torah. Because they deny the Torah, that teaching indicates that their sign was empowered by something or someone other than God. Someone claims to be a prophet. This is the second scenario. Someone claims to be a prophet. They produce a miraculous sign. They affirm the Torah. That their affirmation of Torah, their teaching of Torah, indicates that their sign was empowered by God. So this really is the bottom line: understanding the teaching of the one claimed to be a prophet and whether their miracle was empowered by God. And so we have to ask, or at least I think it's important to ask another question, which would be, would God validate a false prophet? The reason I think this is really key is because when I talked to the rabbi at the tent, he said, well, even if Jesus rose from the dead, that would just be a test from God. And so the question is if Jesus is a false prophet, as this rabbi would submit, then would God raise him? Or another way to put it is, would God validate a false prophet? And so I'm going to say the answer is no. And the reason I say that is actually because of Deuteronomy 18. So there's two texts in Deuteronomy, or the Torah, that speak of identifying a false prophet. One of them is Deuteronomy 13. One of them is Deuteronomy 18. And here we read, "And if you say in your heart, how may we know the word that the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass or come true, that is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him." So really, when I read this text, it leads to the following observation: God would not fulfill the prophecy of a false prophet. And therefore, God would not validate the claim of a false prophet by empowering their predicted miracle. I'll say that again. So God would not fulfill the prophecy of a false prophet. We see this here clearly in Deuteronomy 18. And it logically follows then that God would not validate the claim of a false prophet by empowering their predicted miracle. So we can ask the question, okay, so then we see the text says, "For the Lord your God is testing you." So what is the test? And so it makes sense to me, and this is a view that I've found in other Jewish writings of understanding the text in this way, is that God does not stop the false prophet from using sorcery, magic, or sleight of hand to lead Israel astray. Demons can empower their signs. And the test is that God allows them to do this. He allows these false prophets to perform these signs and wonders in order to test Israel's love and faithfulness to him. But this is different. This is different than God being the source of their power for their miracle. He's allowing them to do this. He's not empowering them to do this. So there's a Torah commentator, Jeffrey Tegay, who's writing for the Jewish Publication Society Deuteronomy commentary, and he just puts it simply that the Lord is testing you by allowing the sign to come true. So we can formulate the argument, or really just the observations, as follows: signs that derive from God's power validate true prophets. God would not validate a false prophet. And God tests Israel by allowing false prophets to produce miracles. So this is the data we have so far. But there's more, because I think we should look in context of what Jesus was doing in his claim to be the Messiah. So I talked about earlier that in Matthew chapter 12, we see that there is a demonized man who is blind and mute, who was brought to Jesus, and that Jesus healed the man so that he could speak and see. And in response to Jesus healing this man, the crowds say, the Jewish crowds there say, "Can this be the son of David?" Meaning, can this be the Messiah, the descendant of King David that is prophesied in our Hebrew scriptures? Like, is this the guy? Is this our Messiah? Is this our Redeemer? And the question really is there that the crowd is asking about this. Well, the Pharisees who are present there respond to that curiosity by saying, no, it's only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that this man casts out demons. They're acknowledging Jesus' miracle, but they're attributing the source of power to demons. Now, why would the Jewish crowd make this point that Jesus could be the Messiah just by seeing him healing this demonized man? Well, Jesus is doing a lot of miracles that are messianic in nature, but really, when Jesus came and revealed his identity as the Messiah in Luke chapter 4, he says, he's quoting from Isaiah 61 when Jesus is in his synagogue on the Sabbath, on Shabbat, and he reads from the scroll of Isaiah, chapter 61, and the text says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me," or Mashiach, "to proclaim good news to the poor. He has set me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then after he reads this text, he puts down the scroll, he goes back to his seat, and he says, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Now, what Jesus is doing here is he's identifying himself as the anointed one, as the Messiah who came to set the captives free. And when you read through the Gospels, you actually see that Jesus was setting people free, specifically Jewish people free, and even in the case of Matthew 15 and Mark 7, a Gentile woman's son, he sets people free from demonic bondage. You read this in Luke chapter 4. You also see this in Luke 13, where there's a woman who comes into a synagogue on Shabbat with a disabling spirit who's been inflicting her for 18 years. This woman is demonized for 18 years so that she couldn't even stand up straight. She comes in bent over. And so what Jesus does is he heals her so that she is able to stand up straight again. Jesus says, "Woman, you are freed from your disability." And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and she glorified God. And so when Jesus explains the significance of this, he actually describes this as this daughter of Abraham, this Jewish woman, has been bound by Satan for 18 years, and he came to loose her from that bondage on Shabbat, which is very fitting because this is what God does for Israel in Leviticus 26, when we read, "I will walk among you and will be your God, and you will be my people. I am the Lord your God who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, so that you would not be their slaves, and I have broken the bars of your yoke and made you walk upright." This woman, he made her walk upright. And even this is what the Lord does in Psalm 146. The Lord, verse 7, "The Lord sets prisoners free. The Lord opens the eyes of the blind. The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down." He lifted up this woman who Satan had bondage over for 18 years so that she could stand up straight. We actually see some really great evidence of what Jewish people around the time of Jesus believed about the Messiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls that were one of the greatest discovery in understanding the Bible and ancient Judaism, where there were approximately 900 scrolls discovered. And in Cave 4, here is a picture from Qumran, we see that in Cave 4 there's a text that was discovered which dates to about the 2nd or 1st century BCE. And this text describes the expectation this community had for what the Messiah would do. The text says how this heaven and earth will obey his Messiah. We see that the Messiah here came to set prisoners free, open the eyes of the blind, raise up those who are bowed down, again, the woman in Luke 13, and the Lord, the Messiah, I believe here is described as the Lord, who will do glorious things that have never been taken place, such as healing the badly wounded and resurrecting the dead and even proclaiming good news. This is something we see when comparing to Jesus, or comparing to the Hebrew word for Jesus, Yeshua. We see that this is exactly the kinds of things that Jesus does throughout the Gospels. And we see this in examples such as Jesus commanding the winds and the sea to be calm, or setting those held captives by demons free, opening the eyes of the blind, specifically raising up the woman bent over. He heals people, he raises the dead, and he proclaims the good news that is spoken of by the prophet Isaiah. So with all of that said, we go back to Matthew chapter 12 and see that this is why the crowds are saying he could be the Messiah. And I encourage you to read Jesus' response to the Pharisees who are saying that he's doing these things by the power of demons. But when we get to Matthew chapter 12, verse 38, we see that some of the scribes and Pharisees are continuing to accuse Jesus of being a false prophet, leading Israel astray. Because they say, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." Now, Jesus is in a situation, right? Deuteronomy 13 says that false prophets can perform signs and wonders. This Greek word here, semeion, for sign, is the same Greek word we find in the Greek translation of the Old Testament or the Torah that we find in Deuteronomy 13. So what they're saying is, give us a sign. And so whatever sign Jesus gives them, they could still claim, oh, it's from demons. So Jesus gives a really powerful answer. He says, "For an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Jesus here is saying that his experience in the earth will be similar to Jonah's experience in the belly of the great fish. As Jonah was in the belly of the great fish, Jesus will come out of the ground, meaning he will resurrect from the dead. It's really cool when you actually read Jonah carefully. A lot of times we read this text and see that Jonah was alive in the fish, but when you read it carefully, you actually see that it seems to be that the text seems to be saying that Jonah was dead. From texts such as, "Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice," or Sheol is really the realm of the dead. We read about how, "To the roots of the mountains I went down, to the land whose bars closed upon me forever, yet you brought my life from the pit." And when we see later in chapter 3 or chapter 2, where we see that Jonah comes on the dry land, we see this word, kum, arise, and it's the same kind of a Semitic word we see where Jesus uses in the Gospels, where he raises the synagogue leader's daughter from the dead to resurrect. So really, the story of Jonah is a story of death and resurrection. It was understood as such by at least one first century Jewish text. And so what Jesus does is he claims that his resurrection would be the sign that would indicate he's the Messiah. So why would Jesus choose resurrection? Of all the miracles Jesus could have chosen, why resurrection? Well, I think very simply, it's only God raises the dead. There could be a broader answer, but just one answer that really gets to the heart of this, because it addresses these Pharisees' claim that he's a false prophet, is that no, only God raises the dead. This is something we see in the Torah and in the Tanakh more generally. We see Deuteronomy 32:39. "See then that I am he, there is no God beside me, I deal death and give life." Or 1 Samuel 2:6, "The Lord deals death and gives life, casts down to Sheol and raises up." This is something, resurrection is something that only God has the power to do. And we actually see that the Jerusalem Talmud, which is discussions of the Torah, of the Tanakh, of Jewish law, we see that there's an example where of the rabbis discussing Elisha, and in that context, the rabbis say, "There is none who raises the dead except the Holy One, except God. Blessed be he, as it is written in Scripture concerning him. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up." Meaning, God has this exclusive power and authority to resurrect the dead. Also, Ezekiel 37, we see here, this is a text that describes the vision that Ezekiel had of the valley of dry bones representing the whole house of Israel. And this is a text that speaks about Israel's restoration, but it describes Israel as dead. And in that context, we see this text that's saying, "And you shall know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and raise you from your graves, O my people. And I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live. And I will place you in your own land. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. I have spoken and will do it, declares the Lord." So Israel is going to know God's unique identity when they witness his power to resurrect the dead, because this is something that only God has the power to do. And a prayer that goes back centuries long, was likely understood and prayed during the time of Jesus, the Amidah prayer. This is a prayer that is prayed 3 times a day by observant Jews. And in the section of the prayer called the Giverot, for God's might, the prayer continuously praises God for his exclusive power to resurrect the dead. We see here, Lord, you are mighty forever. You call the dead to life. You are mighty to save. You sustain the living with loving kindness, and with great mercy you revive the dead. You uphold those who fall, heal the sick, set the captives free, and keep faith with those who sleep in the dust. Who is like you, Master? Who can be compared to you? You decree death and restore life, causing salvation, in Hebrew Yeshua, to come forth. You are faithful to revive the dead. Blessed are you, O Lord, who calls the dead to life. So this really is a prayer that, just like a beating drum, is praising God for his unique power to resurrect the dead. Who is like God? He's the one who resurrects the dead. There's a book called The Art of Jewish Prayer, and Rabbi Yitzhak Kerzner and Dr. Elisa Aiken, they describe how there's a text in the Talmud that says how there are 3 keys to the world that God personally holds: the key of rain, and also one of them is the key of the resurrection of the dead. And I really like where they say this: we should not think that anyone has this as an independent ability alongside God. The ability always comes from the same source, God. That is why we reinforce 3 times in this verse that this power comes from you, God, in speaking of the Amidah prayer. So we can formulate this argument like this: Jesus claimed his messianic identity would be validated through the sign of his resurrection. Signs that derive from God's power validate true prophets. God would not validate a false prophet. Jesus rose from the dead. Only God raised the dead. Therefore, Jesus is the Messiah. It follows logically and necessarily from those premises. Really, God is the one who resurrects the dead. That was Jesus' sign that would demonstrate and show that he's the Messiah. So his resurrection is the indication that he really is who he claimed to be. He is the Messiah. So the objection that I heard from the rabbi, and one that is not uncommon, but it is that Jesus can't be the Messiah because he's a false prophet according to Deuteronomy 13. They're viewing Jesus as leading Israel away from the Torah. But really the response, to put it succinctly, is that Deuteronomy 13 helps us see that Jesus' resurrection is God's validation that Jesus is the Messiah who taught Jewish people to live in obedience to the Torah. And the way we know that it talks about, we know that how we see the resurrection indicates his messiahship, but also it's revealing of his view of the Torah. Because remember, looking at the text, the false prophet is leading Israel away from keeping the commandments that God gave Israel, and God tests Israel by allowing the false prophet to do this. But what we find here is that because the false prophet is leading Israel astray, that the resurrection, God empowering the sign for Yeshua, for Jesus, it actually shows the reverse is the true for Jesus. He's actually teaching Israel to remain faithful to keeping God's commandments. So if Jesus taught that the Torah was come to an end, that the Torah has been abolished, that he's leading the Jewish people away from keeping God's commandments, then he would be a false prophet. But what we find is that the resurrection shows that he is a true prophet, even more so, he's Lord, he's Messiah, which shows that he really is teaching Israel to remain faithful to the commandments that God gave them. We don't just know this from the resurrection itself, we know this when we read the text of the New Testament through the Gospels. In Mark chapter 12, we see an example of when a scribe came up and they heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that Yeshua, Jesus, had answered them well, asked him, which commandment is the most important of all? And so Jesus doesn't say, well, actually, the Torah has been abolished. I've come to lead Israel to follow this other God. He doesn't say anything like that. He actually says, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So what we see here is that Jesus does not fail the Deuteronomy 13 test. Instead, Jesus upholds the Torah, recites the Shema, Israel's allegiance to God, and he cites Leviticus 19:18 and Deuteronomy 5 that love is the substance of the Torah. So the resurrection is not only God's validation of Jesus' messianic identity, it's God's pronouncement that Jesus taught the Jewish people to remain faithful to the commandments. All right, so in Mark 12 we see there that really it's an example of Jesus' teaching when it comes to him upholding the Torah. So it's not just that the resurrection indicates that he's the Messiah, that the resurrection indicates he is the Messiah, and he taught Israel to remain faithful to keeping the commandments. So really, from the rabbi's perspective that I was talking to at the very beginning in the tent, he had a misunderstanding of really who Jesus is, what he taught, which is sadly the state of a lot of people within the Jewish community who don't follow Jesus. They have an understanding of Jesus that isn't accurate to who he is as a rabbi, as a Jewish person who taught faithfulness to the Torah for the Jewish people. And so really, when we look at the evidence for the resurrection, we see that even from the Deuteronomy 13 itself, this really shows why the resurrection would be the indication that he is the Messiah. And so the argument I'm presenting here, it's not really a new argument. It's really an ancient argument that goes back to Acts chapter 2. When Peter was in Jerusalem to celebrate the Jewish festival of Shavuot, the celebration of the giving of the Torah, where Jewish people from around would come and travel to Jerusalem to celebrate this holiday, we see he's in the temple, and this is 50 days after Passover. So Yeshua, Jesus, has ascended to heaven. He was here for 40 days. He ascended to heaven. And he's there in the city of Jerusalem where all of this happened, where Jesus rose from the dead. And he addresses the Jewish crowd. He says, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses. Let all the house of Israel therefore know assuredly that God has made him both Lord and Messiah, this Jesus whom you crucified." And really we see here that the resurrection is the indication that Jesus is Lord and Messiah. Jesus is a man authenticated by God through miracles, as said there. And he was executed because the Jewish leadership thought he was a false prophet. But God resurrected Jesus from the dead, which is the indication of Jesus' divine and messianic identity. And it's really amazing to see that when Peter makes this argument, we see here, now when they heard this, they were cut to the heart, and they said, Peter and the rest of the apostles, "Brothers, what shall we do?" And Peter responded to them and said, "Repent and be immersed or baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus the Messiah, for the forgiveness of your sins, and you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit, for the promise is for you and for your children and for all who are far off, everyone whom the Lord our God calls to himself." This is really key because the second part of the sign of Jonah in Matthew chapter 12, verse 41, it's not just resurrection. It's also the repentance of the nations. We see the men of Nineveh repented at the preaching of Jonah, but something greater than Jonah is here. This is something that is recognized by Jewish scholars. Pinchas Lapid, for example. Pinchas Lapid is a Orthodox Jewish scholar, the late Dr. Pinchas Lapid, and he, on his examination of the resurrection, he really saw this as something that actually occurred in history, in Jewish history. And instead of explaining this as like God just doing this out of nowhere, he says this, it's really remarkable. He says, be that as it may, as a faithful Jew, I cannot explain the historical development which, despite many errors and much confusion, has carried the central message of Israel from Jerusalem into the world of the nations, as the result of blind happenstance or human error or a materialistic determinism. He's a follower of God. He says, the experience of the resurrection as the foundation act of the church, which has carried the faith in the God of Israel into the whole Western world, must belong to God's plan of salvation. So really what what Pincus Lapide sees is by raising Jesus from the dead, by God raising Jesus from the dead, this was an act really of bringing Gentiles to turn to the God of Israel, which really is cool because this is what Jesus predicted in Matthew chapter 12, verse 41, that it would be the repentance of the nations. And he also accepts the resurrection as an event that occurred in history. So he didn't, from what I know, he never ended up becoming a follower of Jesus. But the points there that we see in the argument and seeing that Jesus' resurrection being an indication he's the Messiah really are astounding. And really he's seeing and recognizing the significance Jesus had on history. Another scholar just to be aware of, Rabbi Jacob Emden, who is a leading 18th century Torah scholar. He has this great comment here on Jesus, who he calls the Nazarene. He says, the Nazarene and his apostles did not wish to destroy the Torah from Israel. God forbid, for it is written so in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. Do not suppose that I come to abolish the Torah. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And so what he goes on to say is that this is, of course, recorded in Luke as well. But he says, it is therefore exceedingly clear that the Nazarene, or Jesus, never dreamed of destroying the Torah. It is therefore a habitual saying of mine that the Nazarene brought about double kindness in the world. On the one hand, he strengthened the Torah of Moses majestically, as mentioned earlier, and not one of our sages spoke out more emphatically concerning the immutability of the Torah. And on the other hand, Jesus did much good for the Gentiles by doing away with idolatry and removing the images from their midst. It's just so cool to see that a Jewish scholar who's understanding Jesus better by reading the text and seeing Jesus as a rabbi who taught Jewish people to be faithful to the Torah, and so much good has come from Jesus that he's turning Gentiles away from idolatry to worship the God of Israel. So with all this said, I just want to share a little bit more about Chosen People Ministries and the work I do if anyone wants to continue to pray for ministry and really to see in, more. As I mentioned, we exist to pray for, evangelize, disciple, and serve Jewish people and help fellow believers do the same. And specifically within Chosen People Ministries, it's a large organization, but I work in the Department of Digital Evangelism in Chosen People Answers. And so really what I do is engage with Jewish seekers online by addressing their honest questions and common misconceptions about faith, Jesus, and the New Testament. And really my goal is to help remove the intellectual and cultural barriers that often stand in the way of Jewish people accepting the gospel message. And I also support Jewish believers by answering their questions to help them grow in confidence and understanding in their faith in Jesus as Jewish followers of Jesus. So we do this in different ways. We have online content, so you can go to aboutmessiah.com to read more of the short form articles that are written with Jewish people in mind to answer really some foundational questions like what is the good news or the Jewishness of the divine Messiah. We also just launched Chosen People Answers. We had one of my colleague and friend Eric, he gave a presentation, I believe it was last year with you all on here. And so he mentioned that we're going to launch a channel. Well, we did launch it. And so if you'd like to subscribe to Chosen People Answers, you're welcome to do that. We send out a newsletter quarterly for Jewish seekers, thousands of Jewish seekers on different topics, different areas. The one you see here is addressing anti-Semitism, and you could find that on aboutmessiah.com/nativ. Also writing articles that are specifically for helping Christians understand the Jewishness of the New Testament and deal with issues related to theological issues, such as the ones here concerning replacement theology. And if we have questions about that, I'm happy to answer. I also teach in churches and teach in synagogues and conferences for Jewish believers and lead a Bible study for young adult Jewish believers. So if you'd like to join in praying for my ministry, I send out a monthly prayer letter, and I really believe in the power of prayer. There's so many people who are praying for me now, and I would love for you to join because the more, the better. God hears our prayers, and it really needed in this area of Jewish ministry. You can do that by just scanning the QR code there, or you can go to chosenpeople.com/pray for Jonathan. I'm only able to do this work because of the generosity of individuals, churches, and groups who can partner with me on a monthly basis to be able to do this work. So if that's you, if that's something that you want to pray about, I'd welcome that, and I pray the Lord blesses you. And I really just am grateful for this opportunity to share with you all about the Jewishness of the resurrection of Jesus and understanding it from a Jewish perspective, understanding where Jewish people are coming from when you bring the gospel, when you specifically talk about the resurrection. And I'd love to answer any questions you have here. I'll do my best at this time.
All right. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for just this wonderful presentation and diving into the apologetics
Absolutely.
of all of this. Let me actually check the chat here. Let's see, it says, excellent teaching, Jonathan. Keisha says this. Excellent teaching, Jonathan. Thank you for sharing. I've been praying about effective ways to share the gospel with Jewish people.
Wonderful.
And then Lori, of course, also says thank you here in the chat. If anyone else is present, now is a good time to also, if you have any questions, now is the time for us to unmute our microphones and let's ask Jonathan any questions he has regarding this topic, or even just something about Chosen People Ministries as well. Going once, going twice. Wow, okay. Um, well, Lori, I think also posted, will those links be available? Yes. These links will be available. We're probably going to have to go through and do a lot of editing on when everything timed out. And then, well, once we have one full cohesive video, it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. That way everybody can view it. Um, so yeah, we'll have all of that ready as soon as humanly possible for everybody to view. But Jonathan, once again, thank you so much for delivering this presentation and taking us on a deep dive into the apologetics of a Jewish look at Jesus' death and resurrection. Um, I really hope everyone is going to join us for our next virtual lecture. So before we all head out, let me look at the next virtual lecture. The next virtual lecture we will have is going to be on November 7th, 2026. It will be our fourth quarter virtual lecture, and it will be a colleague of mine, Dr. Christopher Jenkins. He is an Egyptologist at Lipscomb University, and the topic of his presentation is going to be Horus versus Jesus, original stories or retelling. So we're going to be looking at the myth of Horus, who, for those who may not know Egyptian mythology, that's the falcon-headed god who is supposedly the very first pharaoh of Egypt, and all pharaohs would have come after him. And then, of course, we're also going to be looking at Jesus's birth story. There is actually some people who believe that, there's a theory out there that the story of Jesus might be a retelling of the story of Horus. But Dr. Jenkins is going to sit down with us next quarter and talk about all of that. This is actually his area of expertise, is looking at Egyptian religion and New Testament stuff. And so we're going to see how basically what that's all about. And just in case, this might be my last virtual lecture hosting. I will turn the reins over to Miss Keisha Trippett, who is our phenomenal social media content coordinator. And she more than likely will probably have the reins in November. We're still working on all of that. But for now, everyone, thank y'all so much for everything. And we will also, Jonathan, make sure that the links to Chosen People's Ministries, all those articles you pulled up, we'll probably try to get the best link we can. That way people can have access to those links.
Yeah.
Um,
Sure, I can send those. And I see one question
yeah.
there from Lori about the website for replacement theology. So there's a couple of articles on aboutmessiah.com, but this is also something, of course, in Jewish ministry we'll need to address on our channel on Chosen People Answers.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll try to get all those links. We're definitely going to get all those links and put them when we upload it to YouTube. That way we can have all the links down below on YouTube and people can be able to click on those and also send us a link for the new channel that y'all just launched as well. That way people can tune into that too. We definitely want to tune into that. So everybody, if this is going to be my last time here, it's been a pleasure hosting these virtual lectures with all y'all the whole time. And maybe Keisha will be here. Maybe we'll be in there in November. Maybe it will be me. I don't know. We're still trying to work everything out right there. But just in case this is my last virtual lecture, I just want to say thank y'all so much for just coming on and participating in these lectures. And once again, Jonathan, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Um, and we everybody have a great rest of your night and tune in for November. Keep an eye on the social media pages for our final virtual lecture of 2026. All right, everybody, see y'all at the Biblical History Center.